We don't serve people like you sitting with someone like her." The words didn't echo. They cut, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the low hum of conversation and clinking glasses like a blade through silk. And for a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath as every head turned toward the corner table where Marcus Hale sat across from Lily Brooks, his posture calm, his expression unreadable, while Lily's fingers froze around the edge of her water glass, the condensation slipping down unnoticed as the weight of that sentence settled over them both. The lighting was warm, golden, the kind that made everything feel expensive and intentional. But now it felt exposed, like a stage where something had gone wrong, and Marcus didn't move, didn't react the way they expected, didn't shrink or argue or even blink too quickly. He just looked at the manager standing beside their table, a man in a pressed shirt and a name tag that suddenly felt too small for the authority he was trying to project. And in that stillness there was something unsettling, something that didn't match the narrative being forced onto him. Lily's voice came first, soft but steady, asking what the problem was, trying to pull the moment back into something reasonable, something human. But the manager didn't look at her. Not really. His eyes fixed on Marcus as if Lily's presence was incidental, as if she were part of the setting and not the situation. And around them whispers began to form, low and curious, a ripple of judgment moving table to table, phones subtly lifted, glances exchanged, the quiet mechanics of a public moment beginning to turn. Marcus had been here before, not in this exact room, but in rooms just like it, where the lighting was soft but the assumptions were sharp, where the rules shifted depending on who you were perceived to be, and years ago those moments had carried heat, frustration, a need to explain, to prove, but now there was only a controlled silence, a patience that came from knowing something the room did not. Lily shifted in her seat, her eyes searching his face for a reaction, for something that would tell her how to respond, but what she found instead was stillness, the kind that didn't ask for permission, the kind that didn't rush to defend itself, and it made the tension stretch even tighter. The manager gestured toward the front, his tone firm, rehearsed, as if this were policy and not personal, and somewhere behind him a server paused mid-step, watching, uncertain, while a couple near the window leaned closer to hear, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. Marcus finally reached for his glass, not hurried, not defiant, just deliberate, and took a small sip as if the moment belonged to him, as if the room would have to adjust to his pace instead of the other way around. And that was when the shift began, subtle but undeniable, because silence like that doesn't come from weakness, it comes from control, and whether they realized it or not, every person in that room was about to learn the difference. Marcus set the glass down with the same quiet precision, his fingers releasing it as if nothing in the room had changed, but everything had, the air heavier now, eyes lingering longer than they should, and Lily could feel it pressing against her from every direction, the judgment, the curiosity, the silent questions no one dared to ask out loud. And yet Marcus remained still, not frozen, not passive, but composed in a way that felt deliberate, like he had stepped into this moment knowing exactly how it would unfold. Lily leaned forward slightly, her voice lower now, steady but edged with something protective as she asked the manager again what the issue was. And this time her tone carried weight, not just concern but challenge, because this was not the first time she had seen customers judged by appearances, but it was the first time it felt personal, the first time it felt like something she could not simply smooth over with a polite smile and a quick apology. The manager exhaled sharply, glancing around as if gathering support from the room itself, as if the watching eyes validated his stance. And then he spoke again, slower this time, choosing each word with care, as though he were building a case rather than resolving a misunderstanding, saying that the restaurant maintained a certain atmosphere, a certain clientele, and that some pairings created discomfort for others, the kind of statement that tried to hide behind professionalism, but carried something colder underneath, something that made Lily's stomach tighten. Marcus finally looked at Lily, not at the manager, not at the crowd, just at her, and in that glance there was something grounding, something that cut through the noise, and for a second the room faded, replaced by quieter moments, late evenings when the restaurant had been nearly empty and they had talked between her shifts, about nothing and everything, about the way she wanted to leave this job someday, and the way he listened without interrupting, without correcting, just present. And that was the version of him she knew, not the one being judged now. A server near the bar hesitated, tray in hand, watching the exchange unfold, while two men at a nearby table leaned back in their chairs, their conversation abandoned in favor of this unfolding scene. And somewhere behind the counter, a low voice whispered that this was getting out of hand. But no one stepped in, no one broke the tension, because moments like this had a gravity to them, a pull that kept people watching even when they knew they should not. The manager gestured again, more firmly now, indicating the exit with a slight tilt of his head, and Lily felt the shift, the escalation moving from suggestion to expectation, from implication to action, and she straightened in her seat, her shoulders squaring as if she had made a decision, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, close enough to Marcus to feel the presence of him without touching, a silent statement that she was not stepping away. Marcus noticed. Of course he did, and something in his expression softened for just a fraction of a second before returning to that same controlled calm, the kind that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. And when he finally spoke, it was not loud, not confrontational, but clear enough that the nearest tables leaned in without realizing it. His words measured, asking a simple question that landed heavier than any accusation, asking whether the issue was truly about the restaurant's atmosphere or about what the manager believed he represented, and the silence that followed was immediate, sharp, because now the room was no longer watching a removal, it was witnessing a line being drawn, and no one seemed quite sure which side they were standing on. The manager did not answer right away, and that hesitation was louder than anything he could have said, because now the question hung in the air, sharp and undeniable, forcing everyone within earshot to confront what had been implied but never spoken, and Lily felt it too, that shift from quiet discomfort to something exposed, something real, as if the polished surface of the restaurant had cracked just enough to reveal what lived underneath. A woman seated near the center of the room set her fork down slowly, her eyes moving between Marcus and the manager with a look that was no longer casual curiosity but focused attention, while a man beside her leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching with a faint frown as though trying to decide whether this was entertainment or something he should be concerned about. And near the bar a young employee whispered to another, their voices low but urgent, because moments like this did not happen often, but when they did, they changed the room. The manager straightened his posture, his jaw tightening as he forced a thin smile that did not reach his eyes, and when he finally spoke, his tone carried that same practiced authority, but now it sounded strained, like it was being held together rather than projected, as he said that this was not about assumptions, it was about maintaining standards, about ensuring that all guests felt comfortable, and yet the more he spoke, the more it felt like he was explaining rather than commanding, justifying rather than enforcing, and that difference did not go unnoticed. Lily's grip on the edge of the table tightened slightly, her knuckles pressing against the polished wood as she looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time she saw something beyond the uniform and the title. She saw uncertainty, the kind that comes when authority is challenged in a way it was not prepared for, and it made her sit a little taller, her voice steadier as she said that Marcus had done nothing wrong, that he had been respectful every time he came in, that he treated the staff better than most of the regulars who spent twice as much money. And her words were not loud, but they carried, because they were true. And truth has a way of cutting through noise. Across the room a phone lifted higher, no longer subtle, the screen glowing as someone began recording openly now. And another followed, because once one person decided to witness, others felt permission to do the same. And the energy shifted again, the quiet pressure building into something visible, something undeniable, while a server who had been watching from a distance finally took a step forward before stopping herself, caught between loyalty to management and the instinct to intervene. Marcus remained where he was, his posture unchanged, but there was a difference now, something in the way his gaze moved across the room, not avoiding the attention but acknowledging it, measuring it, as if he understood exactly how quickly a moment like this could grow beyond its original shape. And when he looked back at the manager, there was no anger in his expression, only clarity, a calm that felt almost out of place in a situation designed to provoke the opposite. The manager glanced around again, and this time the room did not offer him support. It offered him scrutiny, every look a question, every silence a demand, and for the first time since he had approached the table, he seemed aware of it, aware that the situation was no longer contained, that it had slipped beyond the simple act of asking someone to leave. And Lily felt that shift as well, felt the invisible line being crossed where this was no longer just about a table, or a policy, or even a single moment. It was about what came next, about who would hold their ground and who would step back. And as the tension stretched tighter, Marcus finally spoke again, his voice steady, controlled, and unmistakably certain, saying that if there was a standard being enforced, then it should be applied equally, and that he would be more than willing to stay seated while that standard was explained clearly, not just to him, but to everyone watching, because fairness, once questioned, does not settle quietly, it demands to be seen. The manager's smile faded completely now, replaced by something tighter, something defensive, and he shifted his weight as if the floor beneath him had become less certain, his eyes flicking not just to Marcus but to the growing number of phones held openly in the air, to the faces that were no longer neutral but attentive, measuring. And in that moment it became clear that this was no longer a private decision disguised as policy. It was a public test of authority, and he was losing control of the narrative. From behind the bar, a taller man in a dark blazer stepped forward, slower, more deliberate, his presence carrying a different kind of weight, the kind that did not need to announce itself, and several staff members straightened as he approached, their posture shifting instinctively, because this was not just another employee, this was someone higher, someone who had been watching from a distance and had now decided to intervene. Lily noticed him immediately, her breath catching slightly because she recognized the shift even before he spoke, and the original manager turned as well, relief flashing briefly across his face as if backup had arrived. But the expression did not last long, because the man in the blazer did not look pleased, he looked focused, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the raised phones, the silent crowd, the tension that now filled every corner of the space. He asked a simple question: what exactly was happening here? And the original manager began to explain, his words coming faster now, less controlled, framing the situation as a misunderstanding, as a matter of maintaining standards. But the explanation sounded thinner with each sentence, weaker against the visible reality around them, and the man in the blazer listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, until he finally turned his attention to Marcus. For a brief second, something passed across his face, something subtle but unmistakable, recognition, and it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a carefully neutral expression. But it was enough for Lily to notice, enough for the moment to shift again, because recognition changes everything, even when it is not spoken out loud. Marcus met his gaze calmly, no introduction, no explanation, just a steady look that held more weight than any title could have in that moment, and the silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken understanding, while the room watched, unaware of what had just passed, but certain that something had. The man in the blazer nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, then turned back to the manager, his voice lower now, but carrying further, asking whether the guest had violated any actual rule, whether there had been any disruption, any complaint beyond perception. And the manager hesitated, because now the question was not about authority, it was about evidence, and evidence was something he did not have. Lily felt it then, the shift in balance, the moment where control began to slip from one side to the other, and around them the crowd leaned in just a little more, the air tightening again as if the entire room was waiting for the next move, because whatever happened next would not just resolve the moment, it would define it. And Marcus, still seated, still composed, rested his hands lightly on the table, his posture unchanged, but his presence now undeniable, as if the room itself had begun to adjust around him, as if the narrative that had been forced onto him was starting to collapse under its own weight, and no one, not the manager, not the staff, not even the watching crowd, could yet see how far that collapse was about to go. The manager opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out at first, and that silence stretched longer than anyone expected, because now it was not just Marcus asking the question, it was the room itself demanding clarity, and the man in the blazer did not look away, his gaze steady, waiting, giving the manager every opportunity to justify what had already been set in motion. A faint murmur moved through the crowd as people shifted in their seats, some leaning closer, others raising their phones higher, the glow of screens reflecting off polished glass and silverware, turning the restaurant into something else entirely, something less private, more exposed. And Lily felt her heartbeat in her throat as she glanced from Marcus to the two men standing beside the table, sensing that whatever came next would not just resolve the moment, but define everything that followed. The manager finally cleared his throat, his voice returning but thinner now, less certain, as he said there had been concerns, that other guests had felt uncomfortable, that it was his responsibility to maintain the environment. And even as he spoke, the explanation sounded hollow, because no one had stepped forward to confirm it. No one had raised a complaint, and the man in the blazer tilted his head slightly, as if weighing the words and finding them lacking. A woman near the bar spoke up then, her voice cutting through the tension with unexpected clarity as she said she had been sitting there the entire time and had seen nothing inappropriate, nothing disruptive. And a second voice followed from another table, a man who added that the only disruption had started when the manager approached. And just like that, the room shifted again, no longer silent observers but participants, their words breaking the fragile narrative that had been built. Lily felt a surge of something stronger now, not just anxiety but resolve, her shoulders straightening as she realized she was not alone in what she saw. And Marcus remained seated, his calm unchanged, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in his expression, a recognition of the shift taking place around him. The manager's composure began to crack at the edges, his eyes moving quickly now, searching for support that was no longer there. And in that moment he made a decision, not one based on clarity but on pressure, stepping forward slightly and saying that regardless of perception, he had the authority to refuse service, that the restaurant reserved the right to deny anyone. And the words landed harder than he intended, because now they were no longer hidden behind implication. They were direct, unmistakable, and the room reacted, a sharper wave of murmurs rising, a few voices questioning out loud what exactly justified that decision. Lily turned to Marcus instinctively, her expression a mix of concern and disbelief, because this was no longer subtle, no longer deniable, and Marcus met her gaze with that same steady calm. But now there was something else beneath it, something quieter but stronger, like a line had finally been crossed. The man in the blazer exhaled slowly, his patience thinning, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, firmer, less neutral, asking the manager one final time to clarify the basis of his decision. And when no clear answer came, when the silence returned once more, heavier than before, Marcus moved for the first time in a way that felt significant, not abrupt, not reactive, but intentional. As he reached into his jacket pocket and paused for just a second, the smallest hesitation, the kind that signals not uncertainty, but timing. And the entire room seemed to lean in without realizing it, because whatever he was about to do, whatever he was about to reveal, was no longer just about defending his place at the table. It was about to change the entire room. Marcus's fingers rested briefly inside his jacket pocket, not searching, not fumbling, but pausing with intention, as if the moment itself needed to catch up to him. And in that stillness something shifted behind his eyes, not outwardly visible to most in the room, but unmistakable in its weight. Because for Marcus this was no longer just about a table, or a manager, or even the woman sitting across from him. It was about something older, something that had followed him long before tonight. And for a fraction of a second the restaurant faded, replaced by a memory he did not often allow himself to revisit. A younger version of himself standing outside a glass building on a humid afternoon, dressed sharp, prepared, credentials in hand, only to be told at the front desk that he must be in the wrong place, that interviews were for candidates, not delivery personnel, and the way the receptionist had not even looked up fully when she said it, the way the security guard had stepped closer, without being asked, as if presence alone was enough to justify suspicion. And Marcus had stood there then too, calm on the surface, but burning underneath, learning in real time that explanation did not always lead to understanding, that sometimes the truth was irrelevant when perception had already made its decision. The memory shifted again, faster now, another moment, another room. Years later, A boardroom this time, polished and quiet, where he had been invited to speak but interrupted before he could finish his first sentence, a senior executive leaning back in his chair, dismissing him with a casual wave and a comment about experience, about readiness, about how certain roles required a certain presence, and the unspoken meaning behind those words had been just as clear as anything said out loud. And Marcus had absorbed it then too, not reacting, not arguing, just watching, learning, storing every moment like this away, not as wounds but as data, patterns that revealed how systems worked when no one thought they were being observed. And now the present snapped back into place, the restaurant, the lights, the eyes, all of it sharper than before, and Marcus slowly withdrew his hand from his pocket, but not with anything in it. Not yet, because the reveal was not about an object. It was about timing, about control, about letting the room fully understand the weight of what had already happened before showing them what came next. Lily watched him closely, her breath shallow, sensing the shift without fully understanding it, and the man in the blazer did not interrupt, did not step in, because something in Marcus's stillness commanded space, commanded patience, and even the manager, who moments ago had been pushing forward with authority, now stood slightly back, uncertain, caught between continuing and retreating, and that hesitation said everything. Marcus finally looked up, his gaze moving across the room slowly, deliberately, meeting the eyes of those watching, not avoiding them, not challenging them, simply acknowledging their presence as witnesses. And when he spoke, his voice carried a different tone now, not louder, but deeper, grounded in something that had been building long before this moment, as he said that he had spent his entire life walking into rooms where people decided who he was before he said a single word, that he had learned to recognize the look, the tone, the quiet shift in energy that came when assumptions took over, and that tonight was no different, except for one thing. And as he paused, the room leaned in again, the tension tightening to its peak, because whatever that one thing was, whatever difference he was about to reveal, it was clear now that it would not just explain the moment, it would redefine it entirely. Marcus let the silence stretch just long enough for every word he had spoken to settle into the room, into the walls, into the people who were now watching with a different kind of attention, and then he moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same measured control that had defined him from the beginning, reaching back into his jacket, and this time pulling out his phone. A simple motion that somehow carried more weight than anything else that had happened so far. Lily watched closely, her eyes following the movement, her mind racing, trying to understand what he meant, what that one difference was, and why the air felt so charged, like something irreversible was about to happen. Marcus unlocked the phone without looking down for long, his gaze still forward, still present, and then he lifted it slightly to his ear, his voice calm, almost casual, but unmistakably precise as he spoke a single sentence that did not need volume to carry authority. He said, "Initiate full review on this location," and for a moment nothing happened, at least not visibly. But the words landed differently, not like a reaction, not like a defense, but like a command. The man in the blazer inhaled slowly, his posture shifting just enough to reveal what he had been holding back, because now there was no more ambiguity, no more room for interpretation, and his eyes flicked briefly to the manager, who stood frozen, caught between confusion and realization, while across the room a few guests exchanged glances, unsure of what they had just heard, but certain it mattered. Lily felt her breath catch again, her heart beating faster now, because the tone Marcus had used was not one she had ever heard before, not in their quiet conversations, not in the small moments between orders and closing time. It was something else entirely, something sharper, more defined, and it sent a ripple of understanding through her that she could not yet fully grasp. A soft vibration came from the man in the blazer's pocket, subtle but unmistakable, and he glanced down quickly before looking back at Marcus. The recognition now no longer hidden, no longer deniable, and this time it stayed on his face, clear and present, as if the final piece of a puzzle had just clicked into place. The manager noticed it too, his eyes darting between them, his confidence unraveling in real time, and for the first time since he had approached the table, he looked uncertain not about the situation, but about Marcus himself, as if the image he had constructed no longer held together. Marcus lowered the phone slowly, placing it back on the table in front of him, not as a display, not as a threat, but as a quiet confirmation that something had already been set in motion, something beyond the room, beyond the immediate moment. And when he spoke again, his voice was steady, controlled, and impossibly clear as he said that the difference tonight was not how he was being treated, because that part was familiar. The difference was that this time the system being used against him was one he understood completely, one he had helped build, and the words landed like a shift in gravity, subtle at first, then undeniable, as the room processed what that meant. Lily stared at him now, really seeing him for the first time in a way that went beyond the conversations, beyond the quiet presence she had come to know. And around them the restaurant seemed to hold its breath again, but this time not in judgment, not in tension, but in anticipation, because something had changed, something fundamental, and everyone could feel it, even if they did not yet have the words to explain it. The shift was no longer subtle now. It moved through the room like a quiet wave turning into something undeniable, because the moment Marcus finished speaking, the man in the blazer straightened completely, no longer observing, no longer neutral, but alert, engaged, and unmistakably aligned. And that alone was enough to fracture whatever control the manager thought he still had. A second vibration echoed, this time not just from one pocket, but from multiple points behind the bar, in the office doorway, even from a tablet resting on the counter, small signals stacking into something larger, something coordinated. And the staff began to notice, their expressions tightening as confusion spread among them. Because systems did not move like this without reason, not all at once, not in sync. Lily's eyes flicked around the room, catching the subtle reactions, the glances between employees, the quiet urgency beginning to replace routine. And then she looked back at Marcus, her breath shallow, because now it was no longer a question of who he was. It was a question of how much power he held, and why he had chosen to sit here, quietly. Until now, the manager took a step back without realizing it, his posture losing its sharpness, his voice no longer leading but searching, asking what exactly was going on. But the question felt misplaced, because the answer was already unfolding around him, not in words but in response, in alignment, in the way the room itself had begun to reorganize. The man in the blazer finally spoke, and this time there was no softness, no attempt to smooth over the moment, his voice clear, direct, and carrying a weight that did not need to be explained as he addressed Marcus by name, not loudly, but loud enough, and that single detail landed harder than anything else, because names change everything. Names confirm what presence only suggests. A ripple moved through the crowd, quiet but immediate, people repeating it under their breath. Marcus, connecting it to something familiar, something they had heard before but had not expected to see here. Like a realization catching up too late. Lily felt it too, the moment everything rearranged in her mind, the quiet conversations, the calm confidence, the way he never explained more than necessary, all of it snapping into a clearer picture that felt both surprising and somehow inevitable. And she looked at him not with distance, not with fear, but with a deeper understanding forming in real time. Marcus did not react to the name, did not acknowledge the shift in tone, because for him nothing had changed. He had always been this person. The room was just now catching up, and when he spoke again, it was not to explain himself, not to justify anything, but to clarify the moment, to bring it to its inevitable conclusion. His voice steady as he said that what had happened here was not complicated. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a decision, a choice made based on perception rather than fact, and that choices have consequences, especially when they reflect something larger than a single interaction. The manager's face drained of certainty, his eyes moving quickly, searching for something to hold on to. But there was nothing left, because the authority he had relied on had shifted away from him, not taken, not forced, but revealed to have never been his to begin with. And around them the restaurant stood still, every conversation paused, every movement suspended, as if the entire space understood that this was the moment everything turned, not with noise, not with chaos, but with clarity, the kind that leaves no room for denial. And Marcus, still seated, still composed, looked directly at the manager and delivered the sentence that ended it, calm and final, saying, "You did not remove a guest tonight. You tried to remove the owner from his own restaurant." The words did not explode through the room. They settled into it, heavy and irreversible. And for a moment, no one moved. No one spoke, because the meaning of what had just been said was still catching up to the people hearing it. The kind of realization that does not arrive all at once, but in waves, each one stronger than the last. And the manager stood frozen where he was, his posture no longer defensive or authoritative, but uncertain, as if the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. And he had no idea where to place his next step. The man in the blazer lowered his gaze briefly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than surprise, because for him the truth had already been confirmed. And when he looked back up, his tone changed completely, no longer addressing Marcus as a guest, but as someone above him in the structure he operated within, his voice respectful, direct, and clear as he said that immediate corrective actions would be taken. And that statement alone sent another ripple through the room, because now there was no ambiguity left, no room for interpretation, only consequence. The manager's mouth opened slightly as if to respond, but nothing came out, because every possible defense had already collapsed under the weight of what had been revealed. And around him the staff began to shift, subtle at first, stepping back, creating space, distancing themselves not physically but professionally, as if instinctively realigning with a hierarchy that had just been clarified in the most public way possible. Lily remained seated, but everything inside her felt in motion, her thoughts racing, replaying every conversation she had ever had with Marcus, every quiet moment that now carried a different meaning. And yet when she looked at him, what she saw was not a stranger, not someone transformed by power, but the same calm presence she had always known, the same steady gaze that had never once asked to be understood, only to be seen. Marcus did not stand, did not raise his voice, did not turn the moment into something theatrical, because he did not need to. The room had already shifted around him. The truth had already done its work, and when he spoke again, it was not to assert dominance but to define the lesson. His tone even, controlled, and impossible to ignore as he said that the issue was never whether he belonged there. It was why anyone believed they had the authority to decide that in the first place. A quiet murmur of agreement moved through the crowd, not loud, not overwhelming, but present, the kind that comes when people recognize something they have seen before, something they have felt but never heard articulated so clearly, and a few heads nodded, subtle but deliberate, as if acknowledging not just the moment but the pattern behind it. The manager finally stepped back fully now, his shoulders lowering, his certainty gone, replaced by the quiet understanding that the role he had been playing no longer fit the reality in front of him, and no one rushed to fill the silence he left behind, because the resolution was already complete, not through force, not through escalation, but through exposure. Marcus turned his attention to Lily then, just for a second, and in that glance there was something softer, something that existed outside of everything that had just happened. And when he spoke to her, his voice carried none of the weight it had held moments before. Only sincerity, only truth, as he said that he had never hidden who he was to deceive her, only to experience something real without expectation, without assumption, and that she had given him that without even knowing it. Lily held his gaze, her expression steady, processing, understanding, and in that moment the noise of the room faded again, not because it was gone, but because it no longer mattered. And around them, the restaurant slowly began to breathe again, conversations returning in, quiet fragments, movement